Wyatt had never been much of a people person. He wasn't rude, he simply preferred his own company. While most people spent their vacation time surrounded by crowds and noise, Wyatt spent his in the wilderness. He enjoyed the quiet, the smell of pine in the air, the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the simple routine of waking up with the sunrise and falling asleep beneath the stars. Over the years, he'd made countless trips into the backcountry. Some lasted a weekend, others stretched on for weeks. He'd camped in the mountains, hunted in remote forests, and spent enough nights alone that the sounds of nature had become more comforting to him than the sounds of civilization. At 46 years old, Wyatt considered those trips essential. They allowed him to escape the stress of everyday life and reminded him why he'd fallen in love with the outdoors in the first place. By now, there wasn't much the wilderness could throw at him that he hadn't already experienced. He knew how to navigate without a GPS. He could identify tracks in the mud and tell the difference between the cries of coyotes, foxes, and bobcats. He knew how quickly weather could turn dangerous, and had learned long ago to respect nature rather than challenge it. Friends often joked that Wyatt was more comfortable sleeping in a tent than he was attending family gatherings. The truth was, they weren't entirely wrong. This year, he had decided to head north. His destination was Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Hidden deep among the endless forests was a small hunting cabin that he'd rented several times over the years. It wasn't much, just a single bedroom, a wood stove, and a front porch that overlooked miles of untouched wilderness. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. Cell service disappeared long before the cabin came into view, and that was exactly how Wyatt liked it. He packed his truck with supplies, loaded his rifle and gear into the bed, and began the long drive north. He planned to spend the next week hunting, hiking, and enjoying the solitude. After decades spent in the outdoors, Wyatt had learned that fear usually came from inexperience. People panicked because they didn't understand what they were seeing or hearing. Wyatt had always believed that as long as you respected nature, there was very little out there to be afraid of. But before the week was over, something was going to happen in those woods that not even Wyatt was prepared for. The drive into Michigan's Upper Peninsula took most of the day. As the miles passed, the towns became smaller and farther apart. Gas stations grew less frequent. Traffic all but disappeared. Before long, the highway gave way to narrow roads that wound through endless stretches of forest. Towering pines lined both sides of the road. The farther north Wyatt traveled, the more it felt as though he was leaving the rest of the world behind. By the time he turned onto the old logging road that led to the cabin, his cell phone had already lost signal. Not that he minded. In fact, he smiled when he noticed the empty bars at the top of the screen. It meant he was finally getting away from everything. The logging road stretched for several miles through dense forest before opening into a small clearing. There, nestled among the trees, sat the cabin. Wyatt pulled his truck to a stop and shut off the engine. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening. The wind moved softly through the treetops. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. Beyond that, there was nothing else. It was the kind of silence Wyatt had driven hundreds of miles to find. He stepped out of the truck and took a slow breath of cool northern air. The cabin stood alone at the edge of the clearing. Beyond it, the forest stretched in every direction. Tall pines and thick cedar trees crowded together so densely that sunlight struggled to reach the ground in some places. Patches of lingering fog drifted between the trunks, giving parts of the forest a pale, ghostly appearance. To the west, the land sloped downward into a swampy area where water pooled among reeds and fallen trees. To the east, rolling hills disappeared beneath an endless sea of forest. There were no neighboring cabins, no visible roads, no signs of civilization whatsoever. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. If something happened out here, help wouldn't arrive quickly. Most people would have found the isolation unsettling. Wyatt found it peaceful. He grabbed his gear from the truck and carried it inside, already looking forward to the week ahead. The cabin was exactly as he remembered. A heavy wooden front door opened directly into a combined living room and kitchen. A worn chair sat facing a stone fireplace that dominated the center of the room. The kitchen itself was small, consisting of a stove, sink, refrigerator, and a wooden table positioned beneath a window that looked out toward the clearing. A short hallway connected the main room to the rest of the cabin. Above the hallway was a small storage attic, accessible by a pull-down ladder in the ceiling. The owners used it to keep old furniture, spare blankets, and other supplies that had accumulated over the years. Wyatt had never had much reason to go up there. As far as he was concerned, if something wasn't useful enough to keep downstairs, he probably didn't need it. At the end of the hallway was a modest bedroom containing little more than a bed, a dresser, and a nightstand. A single window overlooked the forest behind the cabin. Across from the bedroom was a small bathroom. The cabin was simple, but that was exactly why Wyatt liked it. A comfortable bed, a working stove, and solid walls were all he needed. The rest was outside. Wyatt carried his duffel bag down the hallway and dropped it beside the bed. He unpacked a few essentials and put the rest in the dresser. He could deal with everything else later. There was still plenty of daylight left, and the cabin wasn't going to heat itself. He stepped outside and made his way to the woodshed near the edge of the clearing. It was empty. The previous guests had apparently used the last of the firewood. That didn't bother Wyatt. Beside the shed sat several cut logs waiting to be split, along with a weathered axe and an old chopping block. He picked up the axe and got to work. The steady rhythm of steel striking wood echoed through the clearing as the afternoon wore on. It was demanding work, but Wyatt had never minded that. He preferred keeping busy, and there was something satisfying about preparing everything with his own hands. One by one, he split the logs into manageable pieces. The excess firewood went into the woodshed, while the rest was carried inside and stacked neatly beside the fireplace. By the time he was finished, the sun had already begun to dip lower in the sky, and enough logs sat beside the fireplace to last several evenings. As the evening approached, his thoughts turned to dinner. He stepped back into the cabin, grabbed his fishing rod and tackle box, and made his way toward a small lake about half a mile from the property. He had discovered the lake years earlier during one of his first visits to the area, and had returned to it ever since. The trail wound through dense forest, weaving between towering pines and ancient cedar trees. The air carried the earthy scent of damp soil and fallen leaves, while patches of fog still lingered in the lower parts of the woods. After 15 minutes of walking, the trees finally opened up. The familiar shoreline came into view. The lake looked exactly as Wyatt remembered it. Quiet, undisturbed, untouched by anything beyond the surrounding forest. Wyatt set his tackle box beside a fallen log near the shoreline and made himself comfortable. Once he was settled, he assembled his rod, baited the hook, and cast his line into the calm water. A gentle breeze drifted across the lake. The surface rippled softly as the evening sun continued its slow descent behind the trees. Then Wyatt heard something far off in the distance. He listened. Wolves. Their howls echoed through the forest before gradually fading away. A faint smile crossed his face. Guess they're out getting dinner too. Wyatt adjusted his grip on the rod and settled back against the log. The evening passed quietly, then he felt a tug on the line. He gave the rod a firm pull and began reeling it in. A modest trout broke the surface of the water. Not particularly large, but more than enough for one man. Wyatt removed the hook, packed away his gear, and started the walk back to the cabin. The temperature had already begun to drop, and the fog that lingered throughout the forest had grown thicker as dusk settled over the Upper Peninsula. The narrow trail wound between towering pines, their tops disappearing into the evening mist. Pockets of fog drifted lazily across the forest floor, swallowing the undergrowth and softening the world around him. By the time the cabin came into view, darkness was beginning to settle over the clearing. Wyatt cleaned and cooked the trout over the stove before eating his dinner beside the fireplace. Once he had finished, he unpacked the rest of his belongings and prepared for the next day's hunt. His rifle was checked and cleaned. The rest of his gear was put where it belonged. Everything was ready. Satisfied, Wyatt added another log to the fire and headed to bed. He woke long before sunrise. The cabin was cold when he climbed out of bed, and his breath briefly fogged in the air before the fire began to warm the room again. He brewed a pot of coffee, ate a simple breakfast, and got ready for the day ahead. By the time he stepped outside, the world was still wrapped in darkness. A thick layer of fog hung over the clearing, turning the surrounding forest into little more than dark silhouettes. The air was crisp and cold. Wyatt pulled on his heavy jacket and orange hunting vest before slinging his backpack over one shoulder. Inside were the essentials he always carried with him: water, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a small first aid kit, and a few snacks for later in the day. His bolt-action hunting rifle rested comfortably in his hands. It had accompanied him on countless trips over the years and had never let him down. After locking the cabin behind him, Wyatt disappeared into the fog. The forest was beginning to wake up. Birds called somewhere in the distance, and the wind moved softly through the towering pines as he followed a familiar game trail deeper into the wilderness. He was looking for deer, nothing more. Eventually, the trail began to slope downward. A small pond lay further ahead. Wyatt knew places like this were often worth checking. Deer frequently stopped for water during the early hours of the morning, and the surrounding brush provided plenty of cover. As he approached, a sound carried through the fog. A howl. Wyatt stopped and listened. A single wolf. That didn't surprise him. Wolves were crepuscular animals, most active around dawn and dusk. If one was hunting near the pond, the deer would probably avoid the area altogether. He'd probably have to hunt somewhere else this morning. Wyatt turned to leave. Then he heard something else. A deep, guttural sound. It reminded him of a wolf's growl, but only barely. Wyatt stopped moving. The noise came again, lower, heavier. A frown crossed his face. Maybe there was a territorial dispute, or perhaps an animal had become trapped somewhere nearby. Curiosity got the better of him. Moving carefully, Wyatt followed the sound through the fog. A massive boulder, half covered in moss, rested near the edge of the pond. Fallen trees and dense brush surrounded it, providing more than enough cover for a hunter to observe the area without being seen. Wyatt crouched behind it and slowly looked out into the mist. At first, all he could make out was movement. Then the shape became clearer. A wolf. A massive wolf. Far larger than any he had ever seen in his life. Wyatt studied the animal in silence. The sheer size of it made no sense. For a moment, he convinced himself it had to be a trick of perspective. The fog, the distance. Something was throwing off his judgment. It had to be. No wolf could possibly be that large. The creature moved along the edge of the pond, its massive frame barely visible through the mist. Even on all fours, its shoulders stood far higher than any wolf Wyatt had ever encountered. Then it stopped. Slowly, it rose onto its hind legs. Wyatt's eyes widened. The animal arched its back and stretched, not like a bear, not like anything he had ever seen in the wilderness. It stood the way a man would stand, tall, balanced, comfortable. Its amber eyes glowed through the fog. Wyatt's breathing became quicker. His heart hammered against his ribs. A stream of condensation drifted from his mouth and curled around the edge of the boulder. Instinct took over. He covered his mouth and shifted his position, trying to make himself smaller while still keeping the creature in view. That was when he heard it. The sound was tiny, just a dry twig breaking beneath his boot. But in the stillness of the forest, it was enough. Wyatt went completely rigid. Out by the pond, the giant wolf remained standing on two legs. Then its head snapped toward him. The movement was impossibly fast. One moment, it had been staring into the wilderness. The next, those glowing amber eyes were fixed in the direction of the boulder where Wyatt was hiding. Wyatt didn't dare move. He felt like a statue. His fingers tightened around his hunting rifle. Through the fog and dense undergrowth, Wyatt could no longer see the entire creature. He caught glimpses of it between the branches. An enormous shoulder, the outline of its chest, those glowing amber eyes burning through the mist. The rest was hidden. It didn't move. It simply stood there. Seconds passed, then a minute. Wyatt began to wonder if it was ever going to leave. Every instinct in his body told him to remain absolutely still. Then, at last, the giant wolf tilted its head. It gave a loud snort, and slowly, it turned away. The enormous figure disappeared into the fog, its heavy footsteps growing fainter with every passing moment. Wyatt waited. Only when he could no longer hear the creature moving through the forest did he finally allow himself to move. He left the boulder quickly, but carefully. Running was out of the question. If that thing was still nearby, drawing attention to himself would be the worst possible mistake. So Wyatt moved with purpose, taking light steps through the undergrowth as he made his way back along the trail. Eventually, the familiar clearing came into view. The cabin had never looked so welcoming. Wyatt unlocked the heavy wooden door, stepped inside, and closed it behind him. For a long moment, he simply sat in the chair beside the fireplace. His hands covered his face. What in God's name had he just seen? He tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was some unusually large wolf, a rare animal that had wandered into the area. But that explanation didn't sit right with him. Wyatt had spent decades in the wilderness. He had hunted these forests before. He had never seen anything remotely like that creature. And the way it had stood, he couldn't explain that. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Wyatt kept himself busy around the cabin. He gathered fallen branches near the edge of the clearing, organized his supplies, and made sure everything was in order for the coming days. But no matter what he was doing, his thoughts always returned to the pond. As evening approached, he prepared dinner over the stove. His arms remained folded as he watched the flames beneath the pot. The image of those glowing amber eyes lingered in his mind. And for the first time in many years, Wyatt found himself genuinely unsettled by something he had encountered in the wilderness. Wyatt had just finished cleaning up after dinner. The dishes were washed and put away. Another log had been added to the fire, and the warmth from the stone fireplace filled the small cabin. Outside, darkness had completely surrounded the clearing. The forest beyond the windows had become an endless wall of black. Wyatt dried his hands and started back toward the living area. Then he stopped. Footsteps. Something was approaching the cabin. Wyatt turned toward the front door. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. A lost hunter? A trespasser? Then the doorknob moved. The metal handle turned. Wyatt froze. Someone was trying to get inside. The movement lasted only a moment, then it stopped, as though whoever had touched it had immediately realized the door was locked. No knocking followed. No voice called out from the darkness. Nothing. Wyatt stared at the doorknob. Then his eyes drifted upward, toward the window above the wooden table. Something was standing outside. He could only see part of its face pressed against the glass. An ear, dark fur, one glowing amber eye, looking directly at him. Wyatt instinctively stepped backward. The reaction was immediate. The creature jerked away from the window and vanished into the darkness. Gone. For several seconds, Wyatt didn't move. Then the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Whether it had tracked him straight from the pond or picked up his scent later, he had no way of knowing. But one thing was suddenly obvious. This wasn't an ordinary animal. The way it had watched him, the way it had vanished the moment he noticed it. It felt deliberate, intelligent. Wyatt sprang into action. The heavy wooden front door was checked first. The deadbolt was locked, solid. He pulled back the curtain and looked out into the clearing. Nothing. Only darkness and drifting fog. Next came the kitchen window. The lock was secure. He carefully looked outside. Still nothing. The rest of the cabin was checked in the same methodical manner. Window, rear door, window again. Everything was locked. Everything was secure. He left the interior doors open. From the living room, he could see straight down the hallway and quickly reach any part of the cabin if he needed to. Only then did Wyatt head for his rifle. He picked it up and checked it one more time before resting it against his shoulder. The familiar weight in his hands brought some comfort. He didn't know what was outside, but whatever it was, he wasn't going to face it unarmed. The fire crackled softly behind him. The cabin was quiet. Wyatt listened. A few seconds passed. Then he heard it. Sniffing. Soft at first, then louder. The sound was moving along the outside wall of the cabin. Wyatt immediately turned toward it and raised his rifle. The creature was close. Very close. He could hear its breathing between the slow, deliberate sniffs. It was the same sound he had heard near the pond. The same thing that had been staring through his kitchen window only minutes earlier. Wyatt remained perfectly still, listening. The sniffing continued. Back and forth, slowly moving along the side of the cabin. Then it stopped. The creature had settled on one particular spot. Another long sniff. Then came the scratching. Claws dragged across the wood with a sound that made Wyatt tighten his grip on the rifle. His mind immediately went to the outside of the cabin. What was over there? A vent? Loose boards? Some gap in the woodwork that he had overlooked? The scratching continued. Whatever that thing was doing, it had found something that interested it. Wyatt's grip tightened around the rifle. The scratching grew louder. Then came a loud crack. The entire side of the cabin seemed to groan. A violent tearing sound followed. Wood splintered. Something heavy struck the ground outside. The noise echoed through the clearing. Wyatt knew immediately that part of the exterior wall had just been ripped away. He had stayed in cabins like this for years. The outer panels weren't decorative. They were thick, weather-treated boards built to endure brutal Upper Peninsula winters. Removing one wasn't easy. A man would have needed proper tools and a fair amount of effort to do it. Whatever stood outside had done it with nothing but its claws. The sheer strength behind something like that was difficult to comprehend. Thankfully, these cabins were built for harsh conditions. Behind the exterior paneling sat thick insulation and solid interior walls designed to keep out the bitter northern cold. One damaged section wasn't enough to get inside. Then Wyatt heard the creature pushing. The wall creaked. A dull thump echoed through the cabin. Another push, harder this time. Whatever was behind the outer panel hadn't given way. The opening it had found wasn't enough. A low growl drifted through the night. The pushing stopped. A few moments later, Wyatt heard heavy footsteps moving away from the damaged section of wall. The cabin was still secure. Outside, the sniffing started again. The creature moved away from the damaged section of wall and continued circling the cabin. Heavy footsteps crossed the clearing. It investigated one section of the cabin after another. Wyatt kept the rifle raised, turning his head as the sounds moved around him. Then everything stopped. No footsteps, no breathing, no scratching, nothing. Wyatt remained where he was. Seconds passed, then a minute. He glanced toward the windows facing the clearing. Only darkness and drifting fog. He looked down the hallway toward the rear of the cabin. Nothing moved. The back door remained shut. The bedroom window showed only blackness beyond the glass. Another minute passed. The silence held. Carefully, Wyatt lowered the barrel of his rifle and listened. No new sounds came from outside. The creature was no longer making itself known. Wyatt remained standing beside the fireplace. The rifle stayed in his hands. He listened. A minute passed, then another. The cabin remained quiet. The fire crackled softly behind him. Nothing moved outside the windows. Nothing brushed against the walls. Nothing scratched at the wood. Slowly, Wyatt began to wonder if the creature had finally moved on. Then something struck the ground outside the front of the cabin with a heavy thud. The sound shattered the silence. Wyatt immediately raised the rifle. The impact hadn't come from the wall. It hadn't come from the porch. Something had landed out in the clearing. He waited. The silence returned. A full minute passed. Then came another thud. Heavy. Solid. Wyatt frowned. What the hell was that? Keeping the rifle ready, he moved quietly toward the kitchen. He stopped beside the window above the wooden table and carefully looked outside. 2 logs lay in the clearing near the front porch. Firewood. They had come from the woodshed. Wyatt stared at them. He couldn't make sense of it. Before he could think any further, something slammed into the back door with tremendous force. The entire cabin shook. Wyatt turned and ran. He kept hold of the rifle as he sprinted down the hallway. A second impact hit before he reached the door. The entire door frame rattled. The deadbolt still held, but the wooden security bar mounted across the door had shifted in its brackets. Another hit like that, and it might come loose completely. Wyatt grabbed the thick beam with both hands and forced it back into place. A deep growl rumbled from the other side of the door. Then came another shove. The timber vibrated beneath the force. The security bar held. Wyatt planted his shoulder against the timber. Almost immediately, he felt something pushing back. A low, rumbling snarl came from the other side of the door. The sound rose and fell as the creature pushed against the cabin, deep in its chest, accompanied by heavy breaths through its nose. The sound was strangely familiar, like a large dog pulling against a rope. Only no dog on earth should have been this strong. The pressure against the door continued. The security bar held. Wyatt kept his footing and pushed back with everything he had. And after nearly a minute of struggling against the impossible force on the other side, the creature finally backed away. The snarl faded into the darkness. Heavy footsteps moved away from the cabin. Then there was nothing. Wyatt kept his shoulder against the security bar for another few moments before finally easing away. His breathing was heavy. He was exhausted, but he didn't have the luxury of resting. Wyatt wasn't sure where the creature had gone. He hadn't heard it for several minutes, but he was convinced it hadn't left. Nothing about this was normal. Not after the firewood. Not after the way it had tried to break through the back door while he was distracted. This wasn't an ordinary wolf. It was far too intelligent, far too strong. Eventually, Wyatt lowered himself into the worn chair beside the fireplace. The heat from the fire helped ease some of the strain in his muscles, but his rifle never left his hands. A few more minutes passed. The tension was getting to him. He decided to check the windows again. Kitchen. Clear. The small window beside the back door. Nothing. Then he reached the bedroom. Wyatt froze. Muddy paw prints covered part of the glass. Dark smears surrounded the window latch. The creature had tried to open it. Wyatt stared at the marks. His mind immediately started racing. How had something that large moved around the cabin without making a sound? What else had it been doing all this time? Wyatt knew how animals moved. He knew the sounds they made. He knew that something that size should have been impossible to miss. The realization sent a chill through him. Whatever was outside wasn't a wolf, and Wyatt no longer had any idea what it might try next. Wyatt checked the cabin again. Every window, every door. He made certain the locks were secure and the security bar remained firmly in place. When he returned to the bedroom, he studied the muddy prints around the latch. The marks weren't random. The creature had reached for the lock. It had tried to work it open. That unsettled Wyatt more than anything else that had happened that night. Strength was one thing. Animals could be powerful. But this thing understood what a lock was. It knew the window could be opened, and it had tried to figure out how to do it. Wyatt checked the latch one final time. It was still secure. There was nothing else he could do. Wyatt returned to the chair beside the fireplace and waited. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then he heard it. Scratching. Above him. His head tilted upward. The sound moved across the roof. Claws dragged against the timber overhead. Wyatt stood and raised his rifle. He couldn't imagine what the creature hoped to accomplish up there. The cabin had survived brutal Upper Peninsula winters for decades. The roof wasn't about to give way. The noises continued. Heavy footsteps. More scratching. Something moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Then everything stopped. Wyatt listened. Nothing. A minute passed. Then another. Movement caught his eye. Through the kitchen window, Wyatt saw the massive animal leap down from the roof. It landed on all fours in the clearing, facing away from the cabin. A moment later, it rose onto its hind legs. The deep growl carried through the night. Then it ran into the darkness beyond the tree line. The entire thing happened in seconds. Wyatt let out a short breath through his nose. He wasn't falling for that twice. He had already seen its little games with the firewood. The rifle remained ready. Wyatt stood completely still, and he listened. By now, he understood something about the creature. It could move without making a sound. If he started walking around the cabin, his own footsteps might cover whatever little noise it made. So Wyatt stood in the middle of the living room and listened. Minutes passed. The fire crackled softly behind him. Then he heard it. A faint creak, so quiet that he almost missed it. Wyatt remained perfectly still. His face didn't move. What was that? The sound hadn't come from outside. It hadn't come from the walls. His mind raced through the layout of the cabin. Then his eyes widened ever so slightly. The attic. Without moving his head, Wyatt looked upward. The pull-down hatch sat slightly open. Only a few inches, but he knew it hadn't been like that before. He never used the attic. He had never opened it. The creature had gotten inside. Every muscle in Wyatt's body tensed, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew where it was, and as far as he could tell, it didn't know that he knew. Otherwise, it would have attacked already. Slowly, his eyes drifted downward. The keys to his truck hung from the loop on his jeans. If he could reach the front door, he might have a chance. But the heavy wooden door would take precious seconds to open. And if the creature dropped from the attic, he couldn't outrun it. Wyatt remained perfectly still. He listened. No movement, no breathing, no sound from above. But that didn't comfort him. The creature had already shown that it could wait. It could move without making a sound. It could study him. And Wyatt knew one thing for certain. He needed an idea, and he needed one fast. He couldn't stand in the middle of the cabin all night waiting for the thing to make the first move. Eventually, exhaustion would catch up with him. He'd make a mistake. Then his eyes drifted toward the fireplace. An idea formed. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only one he had. In one motion, Wyatt grabbed a burning log from the fire. The heat tore through his hand, but he ignored it. The second he threw it, he sprinted for the front of the cabin. The burning wood struck the partially open attic hatch. A deep snarl erupted overhead. The creature came crashing through the opening. The burning log tumbled down with it and rolled beneath its massive body. A sharp yelp escaped the creature as the flames briefly singed its fur, just like a dog that had been stepped on. Wyatt reached the kitchen. The front door was only a few steps away. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing the heavy wooden table with both hands, he shoved it backward into the creature's path. The legs scraped violently across the floor. The heavy table slammed into the creature as it struggled to rise after crashing through the attic hatch. Wyatt didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed the handle, unlocked the heavy wooden front door, and threw it open. The freezing night air hit him immediately. The moment his boots touched the porch, he spun around and pulled the door shut behind him. Then he ran for the truck. Wyatt sprinted across the clearing and yanked open the truck door. He threw himself inside and jammed the key into the ignition. His hand slipped. The engine didn't turn over. A violent crash erupted from the cabin. The creature was throwing itself against the front door. Wyatt kept his eyes on the keys. Another impact, harder this time. For a fraction of a second, he looked up. He knew he shouldn't. The heavy wooden door still held, but not by much. He fumbled with the ignition again. The banging grew more violent. Wood cracked. Then came the barking. Deep, aggressive, furious. The sound echoed through the clearing and sent a chill through Wyatt's entire body. The thing was coming through. The engine finally roared to life. Wyatt slammed the truck into gear and drove. The cabin disappeared into the darkness behind him as he sped down the old logging road, leaving whatever had followed him in those woods far behind. He didn't look back. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck. The headlights cut through the fog hanging between the trees. Every few seconds, Wyatt glanced into the mirrors. Nothing followed. No glowing amber eyes. No massive silhouette moving through the forest. Still, his foot stayed firmly on the gas. Several long minutes passed before the logging road finally gave way to pavement. The main road stretched out before him. For the first time all night, Wyatt felt some of the tension leave his body. Then it came. A long, deep howl rolled across the wilderness behind him. It echoed beneath the moonlight and drifted through the endless trees. Wyatt gripped the steering wheel tighter. He never went back to that cabin again. If you enjoyed tonight's story, subscribe for more original horror. And until next time, if you ever get the feeling that something in the woods is watching you, don't stay around long enough to find out what it is.